We don't know a whole lot about Fountain Branch Carter's early life. We know, of course, he came here when he was a boy with his family. They lived out kind of southwest of Franklin, around the area that most people know today as Leaper's Fork. He really grew up in and around Franklin. In the early years, he did a number of things. He had a store downtown. He did a good bit of surveying work. But really, up until he was in his early to mid-20s, we don't have a whole plethora of information. Most of what we know about him, of course, is after 1823 when he marries Polly Atkinson. The Carters came from Halifax County in Virginia, so they, like so many other families in the area, like the McGavicks at Carnton, just countless others, they were this huge exodus of people coming from Virginia and North Carolina and coming across the Appalachians and establishing a new home and a new future out here in Middle Tennessee. Fountain Branch bought about 20 acres of land here on the west side of Columbia Pike, just south of Franklin. He started work on the house 1829, 1830, and it really is very unique from an architectural standpoint. I mean, there are a number of homes around the area that are like Carnton or even Rippavilla. Carter House is extraordinarily unique. It's kind of a mishmash of different architectural styles, but it's also very small. It's very modest. There's really two primary rooms on the main floor. Then there's a couple of bedrooms upstairs, and there's actually living space downstairs. This home, like any others, even remotely similar, was almost certainly constructed by slave labor, and they seem to have moved in probably about 1830 or 1831. Like most families in the area, early on, they're growing Middle Tennessee staples, corn and grain, they raise livestock. But cotton becomes a very, very lucrative commodity, and although we're right on the north edge of the cotton belt, Fountain Branch had a cotton gin constructed in the early 1850s, and then he begins growing cotton. So he's growing it for himself, but he's also ginning other people's cotton, and that continues up until the time of the war. And actually, they're growing cotton during the war. We know they were actually picking cotton in 1864, and then they continued to grow it for years afterwards. In 1860, Fountain Branch owned 28 slaves. The vast majority of them were women and children. We don't know why. It could have been just randomness. However, the lack of male slaves could also be because some slave owners quite simply thought that female slaves were easier to control, easier to manage, easier to deal with, if you will. They were certainly less inclined to escape, but also we should not forget that female slaves not only worked in the homes and were domestic slaves, but they also labored in the fields right alongside males. So there probably isn't one answer. Could be a couple, and it could be, again, just random kind of chance and circumstance. There are Carters jammed all throughout this place. I mean, really for about 30 years, there are people all throughout it. In fact, we're sitting in what was the family parlor and formal parlor. Almost every room in the house has kind of a dual use. Fountain Branch and Polly had 12 children, 8 of whom survived to adulthood, and then eventually there are grandchildren living here. So it's a packed house, no doubt, for a long time leading up to war and even for a number of years after the war. Well, 1863 is a really unique time because you have this wild social upheaval. Although the Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to Tennessee, you saw enslaved people all over this area escaping, and Carter's own slaves, many of them, run away looking for their own freedom. I've always found it so incredibly ironic that when Fountain Branch Carter and Polly bought this piece of property and decided they were going to build a house right here, which is literally at the top of a very small hill. It's a wonderful view. They could have had no idea. Its perfect location would be the perfect location for U.S. troops almost 35 years later. So when John Schofield's army begins to arrive here just before sunup on Wednesday, November 30th, as they get close to town, what do they see? The Carter House. It isn't the house that draws their attention. It's the fact that it was a perfect defensive position. It was close enough to the town to set up a defensive line, just far enough away from the work that was being done by the engineers to give them the space they needed. It just puts everything that Fountain Branch knew, his home, his family, his land, his entire life, right in the crosshairs of this brewing storm. And so over the course of just a few hours, the U.S. Army arrays itself all over Carter Hill. Troops spreading to the east, spreading to the west and to the northwest. It's a shame that Fountain Branch didn't leave behind some more detailed recollections of of that morning, because I just can't even fathom what was running through his head as he watched this thing begin to unfold. The Battle of Franklin is exceptionally violent, bloody, and awful because it's late in the war. The two sides are intimately familiar with one another. When they got locked together about 4:30 that afternoon, as the sun was beginning to set, and then twilight and darkness descends on the field, it's just a death struggle. Close to 40,000 men just beating each other to death in places. It is little wonder that the survivors never forgot the ferocity of the fighting, and it's really little wonder that Carter House and the Carter Gin were seared into the minds of those who survived, because this was right in the center of this like smoldering, exploding volcano, and so was the gin. And to this day, it is Carnton and Carter House that those who were here remembered most vividly. Everything else seemed to be almost periphery. It's not like there weren't other homes south of here like Everbright. I mean, gosh, it's not like the Lotes house wasn't here. Nobody remembered those places. This was a small battlefield, and 40,000 men locked together and jammed in this incredible spot. And then, incredibly, like a scene out of a movie, you have the Carters. This 67-year-old man and his oldest son, his daughters, his grandchildren, trapped in the basement. But it is to the west of here that something else is unfolding. It was Todd Carter, the middle son, who hadn't been home for 3.5 years. He comes charging across this ground southwest of here. For years, people said, he was going home. He was headed right toward the house. And it really wasn't until we started to reclaim the battlefield and we took down some of the old crummy fence lines, chain link fence and stuff like that that obstructed views. And to be able to go a couple of 100 yards southwest of here, you can see he literally was going home. He was headed right toward the house. When the Carters, the Lotes family, and a handful of enslaved people came out of the cellar here, early morning, December 1st, the scene was one of just complete and utter destruction. You had suffering as far as the eye could see. And it wasn't just the dead, it was the wounded, and the sounds, and the screaming, and the crying, and the praying, and the animals dying. It's this wall of sound, it's this endless visual spectacle that initially the darkness hides. There's a US soldier, a guy in the 50th Ohio, who actually had been captured during the fighting, and then when he woke up, the Confederate who'd captured him was gone. So he started kind of ambling this way, and he said he was moving toward a small brick home. And he said he encountered a middle-aged man leaning on a fence in a white linen shirt. It had to be Moscow, Fountain Branch's oldest son. And he said he attempted to engage the man in conversation, and he said he just looked right through me. And I think Moscow, like others, was coming to grips with what was all around them. And then this goes on for days. The Carters, after the war, they lived here for a long time. Fountain Branch died in 1871, died in the home right here. But Moscow farmed for years. He kept it going. Obviously, the situation was very, very different than it had been pre-war. He made some modifications and changes to the home. The gin was torn down in the 1880s. And then he sold it in 1896. He moved east of here, lived in Triune for a long time. But he lived until 1913. He lived a long time. Imagine the changes he saw in his life. The modern reclamation movement began now almost 20 years ago, and the first big phase of it was adjacent to Carnton. But then we put our sights on this hallowed ground that was all around Carter House, and we bought tract after tract after tract, but we started to piece it back together. It was really remarkable. The first time I ever saw this battlefield, and I was standing out there looking back this way. And I was actually looking at a dumpster that sat behind where the Domino's Pizza used to sit in the strip mall, where so much fighting had occurred, where so many of Pat Claiborne's men had fallen, where so many U.S. troops had resisted the tide that nearly engulfed them. And I thought, goodness, how did this happen? And if people visit today, they don't remember the Pizza Hut or the Domino's or the flower shop. They just see an open piece of ground, and we've saved now about 25 acres here, in addition to Carter House and the ground around it, which of course is owned by the state of Tennessee. And it's really wonderful. I think in some ways this is what the veterans wanted. They wanted people to come here, not just to remember what had happened, just the battle itself and the units and the heroism and the bravery, but they wanted people to see what we'd really done to one another. That this was the end of the war in some regards. And It was a terrible price that was paid. The immense amount of human loss and suffering was something they wanted posterity. They wanted us to walk this ground, to reflect on what we had to go through. This is the price we had to pay to end slavery, and this is the price we had to pay to once and forever put aside this idea that states could just willy-nilly do whatever they wanted, and that we're one country, one United States of America. Different people, different sections, different states, different ideas, but we're one. So I think the house itself is a legacy to them, to their lives, to their experiences. But it still all comes back to that one day in November 1864.